Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our second conference in our WWI conference series. We're so happy to have you here, and we're excited to be spending the day exploring the future of the workplace with you all. My name is Emma Fusco. I am a Learning and Development Coordinator with the Work Wellness Institute, and I will be guiding you through our sessions today. Before I begin, I would like to draw your attention to the accessibility button on the right-hand corner of your screen to the left of the notification bell. Please use this feature to ensure feedback is optimized to you and your needs. And if you'd like to enable the captions, please press the CC transcription, which should be right below my face here. And if you're experiencing any technical difficulties, please use the orange chat box on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen, and a member of our team will be with you. With that, I'd like to begin our time together by acknowledging that I have the privilege to live and work on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the Coast Salish people, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam nations. I'd also like to thank our funders, our speakers, all of our partners, and all of you for making this conference possible. As an organization, WWI works to turn research into practice and mobilize knowledge to positively impact workplace health practices. We are committed to our vision of creating safe, healthy, and inclusive workplaces, which is why we are so excited to be gathered here today to learn from experts in their field and together take part in creating healthier workplaces for all. With that, I'll hand it over to our President and CEO, Dr. Cameron Stockdale, to give some opening remarks.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for attending the second event in our three-part conference series. We stand here today on the brink of a technological revolution that will fundamentally alter the way that we live, work, and communicate with one another. The scale of this change in size, scope, and complexity means that how we move forward tackling these issues that this change generates must be integrated, comprehensive, and involve all stakeholders, including those of you who are here today. It wasn't the pandemic that started this workplace revolution. Rather, it was the spark that accelerated innovation and changed the face of work. Clearly, though, this is an opportunity for us to coalesce around the research and the expertise here today on the future of work, which will enable us to make our workplaces better and more productive. My name is Cameron Stockdale. I'm the President and CEO of the Work Wellness Institute, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this conference. Exploring the workplace of the future was brought about by events that we've all experienced, which have disrupted our understanding of the workplace practices and the labor markets. With events such as COVID, we accelerated the changes in work. We saw a decline of traditional work arrangements and the progression of more precarious forms of employment, including gig work. So now more than ever, we need to think about how we ensure the health, safety, and inclusion of all workers so that everyone has an equal opportunity to contribute to our community. The disruptive events of the last few years have shown us that while innovation and technology can make work more efficient and increase productivity, we can never forget its potential to create inequality, particularly in the displacement of people, and this happens across all sectors. The changing nature of work has the potential to diminish some of our quintessential human capacities, such as compassion, cooperation, and collaboration. The Work Wellness Institute was founded 36 years ago to address some of these issues. Certainly at that time it would be difficult to comprehend the technology of today, but our focus on mobilizing knowledge and resources that work toward reducing barriers to employment and providing opportunities for vulnerable populations resonates today more than ever. Therefore, our goal with this conference series is to bring national and international attention to the kind of workplaces we want to create in the future. It's against this backdrop that we invite you to participate in our conference, where you'll be invited to reflect, think critically, and learn from experts in their field so that we can harness the abundant potential of people and each of us can become a catalyst for cultural change in our workplace. Our hope is that when you close your eyes and envision what the workplace of the future can become, we have helped you paint that picture so you can play a leading role in that change.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Stockdale. Our opening session today is Navigating the Hybrid Workplace, an Inclusive Approach. Before I hand it over to our wonderful panelists, I have a few technical housekeeping points for the session. Hopefully, you've been able to hear and see our faces through your screen and hear us. Again, if you have any issues, please navigate to that orange chat button on the bottom left-hand corner of your screen and someone will be able to help you. If you'd like to follow along the presentation slides, you can find them below this presentation under Feed Loop in Files. We ask that everyone remain muted throughout the presentation, and we encourage you to please use the live chat you see on your Feed Loop screen to submit questions. This presentation will include some polls. You'll be prompted when it's time for a poll, and you'll be able to submit your questions on the screen. For the best viewing experience, we do recommend full screen. We will be collecting all questions submitted through the session and follow it up with a question and answer based on the questions submitted. To moderate this panel, we are pleased to welcome Melissa Eagan. Melissa Eagan is the National Lead of Episodic Disability at Realize and has worked in the field of health and HIV for over 15 years as an educator and facilitator. Melissa's experience includes frontline work at YouthCo and CATIE. She works extensively with marginalized LGBTQ and Indigenous people, delivering and developing workshops, as well as creating online learning across Canada.
Employers, as well as what the research is showing. So if we can move to the next slide, please, you'll see some highlights with regards to what's been happening there. So employee sentiment, exceptionally clear. There is a clear preference for work from home or a hybrid type component, which is most of the organizations attending here today are sitting in that position. And of course, this is where practical. It's difficult for healthcare, for example, in all instances to work remote. Hospitality, transportation, essential services, food infrastructure, these sort of things, quite difficult to completely remove that interactive component. And we don't really want or need that. We're social creatures. We thrive on this sort of thing. So being able to support people where they're at from both perspectives does make an awful lot of sense. Now, what's quite interesting, and the research is very clear, is that employees are willing to change jobs to gain better alignment with their own preferences when it comes to the benefit strategy or ability to work from home, or perhaps even access services related to mental health. So building resiliency, building mindfulness, helping people charge their batteries and protect their batteries in this sense. People are very much asking for this from employers. And when employers aren't stepping up and giving it, people are moving. Of course, there is also a concept of total compensation, wage pressures on the upside. So you're seeing this groundswell or this sway, if you will, in favor of employees. Now, one of the other things that gets a fair amount of attention these days is this concept of the Great Resignation. I'm not a fan of that term. I don't think it's an accurate reflection, simply because with that, there's an implication that people are resigning and exiting the workplace and exiting the workforce. But that's not necessarily the case at all. The data don't support that. There's actually a very, very few proportion of people who are truly resigning and exiting the workforce altogether. In fact, it's really a great realignment of employees with benefit plans that much better suit them. So all the things that I mentioned before that are becoming much more important for individuals are definitely in alignment with what people are asking for these days when it comes to their employment relationships. So I think a much better term is this concept of great realignment. Next slide, please. So one of the things that was very clear and is very clear in the applied research is that employees are coming back to places of work. We can see it in the poll that we just did. We can see it in a lot of the sentiment out there. We have to be very careful of terminology. This is, if we're striving for an inclusive environment and underscoring, persons with disabilities, diversity, equity, inclusion, social determinants of health, these sort of things, it's a disservice and a misnomer to say that returning to work is what's happening, because it's not the case. People never stopped working. And I remember I was on a panel early on as an epidemiologist in the pandemic, and somebody had mentioned return to work, and it did get a lot of people's a negative reaction, because the sentiment is that people are working harder, if not more so than they were prior to the pandemic. But the semantics aside around the terminology, that's why I use returning to places of work. People are coming back to those places of work, but not all are coming back for good. And I think this is absolutely critical as we move into the next phases of the pandemic, and how we can help best support people and organizations navigate this concept of this changing nature of work. And one of the key elements that a lot of folks in HR look at is employee engagement, and this is an absolutely critical measure. Now, Gallup does a fair bit of high quality research in this particular space, and they released some data not that long ago, within the past couple of weeks. And what they found was that employee engagement was highest for hybrid or fully remote workforces and lowest for those fully on site. So definitely pause for concern for organizations who are of this antiquated mindset that people need to be on site in those traditional work environments. That is not the case. In fact, research is very clear that productivity has stayed the same, if not increased, during the pandemic, during working from home where practical. And there's in fact some really good research studies that have been employed. I reviewed one not that long ago that actually was done prior to the pandemic, where they used one of the hurricanes in the southern US when a workforce had to move to a fully remote position, and they actually had all the metrics in place around supporting those folks, and their productivity went up. So that there's lots of evidence to show that this in fact can happen, and in fact does happen, and folks and organizations really need to be cognizant of this. Next slide, please. So really the take home message from an employers when it comes to workplace health and productivity are to be flexible, truly understand where employees are at and be empathetic. I spent a lot of time interviewing employees over the past little while, and the lack of empathy extolled by some employers has not gone unnoticed. And this is contributing to some of the factors that we've seen around people who are looking for alternative employment arrangements and employment agreements. Next slide, please. So with that being said, here's some other common elements that we're seeing around this changing nature of work and this hybrid workplace. Work-life balance, I think that's an antiquated term. I'm a big fan of the concept of work-life blending, particularly because whenever we remove commutes and remove the time associated with that, and of course, given the inflationary pressures, the cost of fuel, the cost of everything going up, being able to spend more time at home while maintaining or increasing productivity is a win-win situation for a lot of folks. Plus, organizations can save on real estate investments and things like this. But this concept of blending is really this personal time, appointments. So rather than forcing people to do things on their own time in the evenings or on the weekends, you can intersperse that throughout the day. Some of my colleagues just put the time in their calendar, and particularly in organizations that have an outcome-focused employment arrangement, which is absolutely critical. So it's not just about the sheer number of hours or being put forward or monitored, but focusing in on the work product, the work outcome, which is where most advanced employers who are truly in sync with what their employees want and need, and what people really want and need as people are treated more so as people. I think that is a much better reflection of where things are at, because it does allow for a much more seamless integration and a focus on really what's important from an outcome-based perspective. Next slide, please. So this brings us to our next poll question. So now we're going to transition into giving organizations some information and data and insights on how to establish best practices when it comes to workplace health and productivity solutions, particularly around work wellness programming. And it has to do with how organizations leverage the power of data. So this question is, how do you normally make decisions about your work wellness programming? Randomly, no rhyme or reason. If it feels good, do it is the first option. Gut instinct, intangibles. Number 3 is some data, perhaps some historical data. Number 4 is a combination of gut instinct and data. And number 5 is more data, perhaps some real-time data. Number 6 is data analytics driven, perhaps some prediction algorithms in place. Number 7 is fully automated, artificial intelligence and machine learning in place. And number 8 is autonomous robots are clearly in charge. I've been using this exact same data set for a number of years now. It's always interesting to see the types of responses when it comes to organizations leveraging data. Now, 2 points while people are filling this out. A couple of years ago, I published some research on artificial intelligence and machine learning for claims experiences. So we wanted to apply some advanced logic to help claim managers navigate and optimize the rehabilitation pathway to get sustainable return to work outcomes. And we brought in some computer scientists to help us out. Some fascinating research there. I'd love to share that with you. Feel free to reach out. Now, another thing is, through the lens of our current state in the pandemic, and as people move on, the very nature of health has changed. I published an article or published a research study in the American Journal of Health Promotion a couple of months ago that looked at status in health risk behaviors through self-report in a large data set, and we've found regression in many instances. So people are under a lot more stress. Sleeping is being impacted, exercise levels are down, people are eating less fruits and vegetables, and this is before the inflationary pressures that we're seeing. So these sorts of data points are quite crucial to helping organizations understand what the current state of the health of their people is, and then how best to support their programming. Now, from an outcome perspective here, a combination of gut instinct and data, 55% of respondents indicated that was the case. Thankfully, only about 5 people indicated random. Fortunately, at this point in time, nobody has fully relegated the human resources and the workplace wellness functioning into the hands of the AI bots. But some folks are leveraging. And over time, there's going to be a lot more availability of these types of data elements and solutions in place to help organizations out. Great, thank you for the feedback there. Next slide, please. So this is a next slide. You might as well hit it 5 times in a row. So data, a lot of organizations, when I have interactions with them, they're under the impression that once they get the data, all the problems are solved and they're golden. And they may have issues with not necessarily collecting the right data, or perhaps they're sitting on a mountain of data and have difficulties truly understanding and leveraging what those data elements are, what story they tell them, what the narrative is. So that's usually wherever people like me get brought in to help people make sense of that, or best case scenario is really design a better solution. Now, when it comes to data validity, reliability, timeliness, completeness, and meaningful nature of data are quite important to establish where you need to go from a workplace health and productivity perspective. But that's not the end of the road. Data leads to information. When we have information, we have some knowledge. We've gained knowledge, and that knowledge in turn leads to insight. And that insight really should lead to action. So really, it's the action that we're after from an organizational perspective when it comes to leveraging the power of data to help us make sure that we're providing the best possible solutions for the organizations from a health perspective, and helping people that are part of that organization achieve their best self. But it's not without issues. Next slide, please. Because there are significant implications for action if your data are not accurate, if they're not timely, if they're not complete. And we've seen these types of things all the time. Remember, years ago, I did some work with one organization, and the other category was used and abused like you wouldn't believe when it came to injury causation. So much so that there was really no useful data to drive their workplace health programming, because they actually had no real idea what the true drivers are, because everybody was defaulting to text-based data sitting in an other category. So we managed to remedy that in short order. Next slide, please. So one of the things that is quite important in today's day and age is the concept of these threaded, these data lakes, this threaded experience and ecosystem, if you will, and having the appropriate information at your disposal and at your fingertips to help you make the best decisions possible. So integrated data sets and their interpretation, which drive information, knowledge, insight, and action, are absolutely critical in the success of modern wellness programming. And so leveraging this makes an awful lot of sense, as you'll see in this next slide. When we look at analytically driven organizations, they outperform. In this case, this is for profits, 49% higher revenue for analytically driven organizations, 20% higher profit growth, 3% higher return on invested capital. Now, this is just for private organizations for profit. If we ship to public, government, not-for-profits, NGOs, these sort of things, there's other analytics that can be applied to that group as well. And using data and leveraging data to help understand where people are at from a health perspective, from a customer service perspective, from a retention perspective, from budgetary adherence, there's all these sort of things. And then when you start layering on all the disparate aspects of health that contribute to that, the absence, leave, and disability experience, the health and wellness programming at the front end, primary, secondary, and tertiary prevention, these sort of elements are all absolutely critical. And we'll touch on those briefly before we turn it over to Allison. Next slide, please. So one concept that is quite important in today's day and age is culture, and where culture fits in this concept of how do we support people, how do we develop and sustain a healthy place to work from a cultural perspective, from a place where people want to work, and then of course from individual perspectives on helping to support people both from a work disability perspective and from a disease management perspective, as well as from a preventative perspective. So beyond work disability prevention into primary elements of risk reduction. A few years ago, I was part of a team and we were trying to define workplace culture for that organization as it related to health. And the idea that we came up with was, if we picture the workplace as a think tank, as a fish tank, and in this case, this employer had about 16,000 employees, big fish tank. All the employees and contractors were the fish. All the supportive elements, so the pebbles at the bottom, the real or fake kelp and things like that at the bottom, the plants, all those sort of things. That was the environment, and the water that the fish swim in was in fact the analogy of the culture. So the culture could even either be supportive and being very helpful from a health perspective, or it could be a toxic environment where it actually makes people sick, and the nature of work and the psychological injury and psychological stress and these sort of elements all came into play. So it was a fascinating way to describe culture and its implications for how do we develop, sustain, and promote the best possible working environment for individuals and organizations that they're part of. Next slide, please. So this is just a high level, as we look at the hybrid working environment, when we don't have people all in the same place on a regular basis, we need to leverage the power of digital solutions, through open enrollment on the benefits side, health risk assessment programming, sustainable behavior change, workflows, all these sorts of elements. There's great quality research to support folks, at work remotely, because as the workforce continues to change and as we change where people work, we're changing the nature of the workplace at this point in time. We have a lot of older people exiting the workforce, and we've got millennials, making up greater than 50%. A lot of those folks are much more in tune and much more engaged with digital solutions than they are with actually speaking with an individual, which is where the preference is for those who are older. So whenever you layer on all these different types of elements in place, it does allow for the creation of a much more inclusive and a much more streamlined and digital environment when it comes to workplace health and productivity. Next slide, please. So that being said, I did mention we touched briefly on primary prevention, secondary prevention, and tertiary prevention from this hybrid workplace environment lens, leveraging technology, leveraging where things are at right now and what we have our capabilities to. As Dr. Stockwell said at the start, there's amazing technologies out there that are the adoption is accelerating, and it's accelerating rather significantly. We've got better risk identification, lifestyle factors, which are contribute more to your health than your access to healthcare or your individual genetics. Personalized programming, self-report, wearables, and in fact, I did some research recently, and it's going to be published in a couple of months, and looking at sex and race in relation to culturally and generationally sensitive approaches, so diversity, equity, and inclusion, social determinants of health, and how these sorts of data elements can be used to inform strategy and decision, and of course, measure program efficacy. From a secondary prevention perspective, it's a little bit different. Usually when we talk secondary prevention, we're asymptomatic disease and we're surveillance. But now, focusing on biometrics at home, we can get genetic data, we can get genetic screening data that can inform strategy remotely. We can inform healthy pathway correction and steer people in the right direction prior to requiring tertiary prevention, which is very much disease management, accommodation, and work disability. So people entering absence episodes. And this is really healthy pathway maintenance. So arming individuals and arming people to get to that point, I think, is quite critical and crucial when it comes to supporting the next generation of workers in this new hybrid workplace. Next slide, please. This is the last slide before we move on into Allison's material, but it does pose some interesting questions from a data perspective and from a best practice perspective and from an evidence-informed perspective. Do you have data that demonstrates whether or not people are ready to change? Is there sustainable changes in lifestyle behaviors, which is the single largest contributor to your health? Do we see improvements in access to healthcare? Do we see improvements in diet, exercise, sleep, hydration, tobacco, alcohol? When we look at what's happened during the course of the pandemic, if we think back to that article I published a couple of months ago, alcohol use, tobacco use up, sleep quality down, exercise down, diet down, hydration down, everything moving in the wrong direction. So people are moving back into these different places and different work environments in a worse state than what they were back in 2019. And then from no conversation about data elements we complete without return on investment and value on investment perspectives, biometric markers for modifiable behaviors, absence, leave, and disability experience, pharmacy spend, medical aid spend, all the different aspects that we typically use need to be included in any discussion so that we can help understand where employers should be going when it comes to helping them and their people navigate that hybrid working workplace experience. Next slide, please. And at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Melissa and then move it over to Allison.
Thank you so much, Dr. Amel. It was just a vast amount of information delivered very quickly, but this happens in these kinds of situations for sure. I think the thing that is just sticking with me the most is this: we're coming back to places of work, right? That there's so much talk in the media and around everywhere, you see it online, that it's return to work, return to work, return to work, right? But what we're really talking about is returning to that built environment, a place of work. And we've received a couple of comments as well. So I think that's resonating with other folks too. I also have a request, and I wonder if it's possible that we might get access somehow or links to some of the research that you've cited. I think there's some really incredible papers that are part of your work. So if there's any way that that could be shared, I think that some folks who are here watching would be really appreciative of that.
Sure, absolutely. Easiest thing to do is to reach out to me on LinkedIn if we're not already connected and ask that, and I can provide the original content. I've published a fair bit of it as well, so we could always get a sneak insight into what's coming down the pipe from that perspective too.
Great. Thanks so much, Dr. Amel. These are some really, really good pieces of information for us to kind of walk forward with as employees and as employers, right? So thinking about it from a couple of different perspectives, which is so wonderful. Up next, we've got Alison Grenier, who is from Great Place to Work Canada, and she's going to highlight data gathered from around the world about workplace wellness and some really good ways to integrate wellness into our workplaces. So with that said, over to you, Alison.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and thank you, Dr. Amel, for really setting the stage, taking a deep dive into sort of the health and productivity data piece, and really setting the stage for where all that lives, which is the context of workplace culture. So if you just want to start the slides again, there we go. So just first, I'll introduce you to our organization, Great Place to Work. So we are the global authority on workplace culture. For more than 30 years, we've been working with companies around the world to really help them gather feedback from their employees, gaining insights on how they can improve, getting benchmarked against other workplaces, and getting recognized when they have created a great place to work. So we know what it means to be a great workplace, and it actually has very little to do with the perks and programs you offer, but everything to do with the relationships that leaders are cultivating within the organization, as well as the connections people have with the work they're doing and the people they work with. So we know perks and programs are important. It's important to take a data-based approach to your programming, but they really only matter once a foundation of trust has been established. So why do we do what we do? So all this comes down to our mission of helping every place become a great place to work for all. So in a sense, we're leading a movement to change the way the world works, creating more resilient, successful, sustainable businesses. So we all know purpose is really in style these days. Every company wants to be a purpose-driven organization and to change the world. But for us, the mission is not just words on a screen to help us build our business. It's truly what drives what we do. We've seen it in action as we see workplace cultures transform. And so one final piece, I think, just to go further. So fundamentally, we believe in creating great places to work for all. So this is regardless of who you are, where you come from, what job you do, whether you work hybrid or remote, and so on. So why? Because this is the right thing to do, but it's also great for business. So think about what your company could accomplish if every employee brought their best to work each day. So this is what we call maximizing human potential. And if you really think about it, it's the very core of what we're talking about when we're supporting workplace wellness. Next slide, please. So how do we do this? So we run the world's largest employee assessment. Each year we survey over 10 million employees from over 10,000 companies, almost 100 countries around the world. And we use this database in 3 ways. So first, most importantly, is to provide that feedback to clients so they can actually improve their workplace culture. We also provide positive recognition to clients that meet our Great Place to Work certification threshold or make it onto one of our best workplaces lists. So that positive recognition to build internal and external brand. And the third thing we do with this data is it gives us insight so we can conduct research and thought leadership. And so next slide, please. And so today, I'm really happy to share with you results from a recent study we conducted on workplace well-being in partnership with Johns Hopkins University. And so in this study, we looked at 14,000 survey responses in 37 countries. So this was a global survey. And the key findings were, I guess, some surprising, some not surprising. So the first key finding was around the broad definition of workplace wellness. So we know that employee well-being means looking way beyond people's physical health or the type of work they do. We have to look more toward the relationships, how they interact with their coworkers, their workplace. We were able to identify 5 dimensions of workplace well-being, which I'll share with you in today's session. And we know that when people have a consistently positive experience across these 5 dimensions, they can do what we call flourish at work. So they can flourish inside and outside of work. And so I'll explain that concept and what it means. And then the other piece, of course, is there is no one-size-fits-all solution to workplace well-being. As Dr. Amel said, it requires constant listening to employees, feeling what they're feeling, where they're at, and really listening to understand. And then the workplace well-being study did have some pretty significant business implications. So what we found is people who experience high levels of well-being in the workplace, they're 3 times more likely to stay and 3 times more likely to recommend their employer to others. And so as Dr. Amel alluded to, people are willing to leave their jobs to seek out a healthier workplace. So next slide, please. So it's time for a little audience poll. And so here I'm going to ask you 2 simple questions on a scale of, I think it's a scale of 1 to 5. So think about how healthy are you as an individual? That's the first question. And how healthy is your organization? And so there's a 5-point scale there. And so you can respond to the first question, how healthy are you? How healthy is your organization? So we have right now almost 50% saying they are somewhat healthy, and 33 very healthy. And now we can move on to the second question, which is how healthy is your organization? And on the organizational front, we're at 33% somewhat healthy and 28% healthy. So I think we could probably close the poll there and see those responses side by side.
Hi, Allison, just popping in to let you know that these shared slides are the results side by side. You'll just scroll down to be able to see them both at the same time.
Okay, perfect. Okay, so for how healthy are you as an individual, we have 48% saying somewhat healthy, 33% saying very healthy. How healthy is your organization? We have 33 somewhat healthy and 28 very healthy. So that's excellent. Thanks to all for your responses there. So it's probably not surprising that people rank their own. If you want to go to the next slide there, please. Not surprising that people are ranking their personal health at a higher level than their workplace health. So one thing we know, it's widely accepted amongst health practitioners that our biological health can be influenced by psychological and social factors and vice versa. So this is basically the biopsychosocial model of health. So what this means is choosing a job can be one of the most important health decisions you're going to make in your life. Your job has the potential to have a profound positive or negative impact on your health. And so what we found is it's pretty difficult, if not impossible, to have a healthy organization with unhealthy employees, just as it's impossible to be a healthy employee working in an unhealthy organization. So these two are inextricably linked and highly interdependent. And so if you think about this from a workplace perspective, as leaders, the most we can expect people to give us is their best. And they can't give us their best if they're unhealthy or the organization is unhealthy. So right at the intersection of healthy employees and healthy workplaces, we see employees flourishing at work. And so that means their personal and work conditions are exactly right for them to bring their best to work. Next slide, please. But the research we conducted with Johns Hopkins University shows us that only about 1 in 6 people in average workplaces are actually flourishing at work. So this data on the screen comes from the US, but the Canadian results are remarkably similar. And so what you're looking at here is the average workplace experience from this workplace well-being study versus the experience at the 100 best workplaces. So these are organizations that are recognized for the highest levels of trust, which is the foundation of the data set that we use. So first of all, you can see only 16% of people at average workplaces are flourishing at work, compared to 58% at the best workplaces. And that actually, to me, is actually still a surprisingly low number, that only 58% are flourishing at the best workplaces around the world. So how did we determine this? So we looked for employee responses to the key statements that are really the best predictors of employees' direct measures of well-being. So we're looking at statements like, this is a psychologically and emotionally healthy workplace. People are encouraged to balance their work and personal life. Management genuinely cares about me as a person, not just an employee, and so on. And then we map those against direct measures of well-being, things like life satisfaction, feeling that what you're doing is worthwhile, having a sense of optimism, and overall feeling of well-being. And so this was the crux of our data. And so I guess the question we asked ourselves is, why are so few people flourishing at work? Why do we have so few people, relatively speaking, even in the best workplaces, that are experiencing high levels of individual health as well as organizational health? One of the things we found is that even amongst the best workplaces, we were noticing some gaps in purpose and connection. So these are two of the key areas needed to flourish at work. So this is where we're expanding our definition of workplace well-being to go beyond physical, mental, emotional health to incorporate things like purpose and connections. So the bottom line here is, if employees ask themselves, why do I work here? And they can't come up with a good answer, or they don't feel connected to their employer, they're willing to leave. So let's look at the next slide here. So we can take a closer look at the dimensions of workplace well-being. So we know employee experience is influenced by many factors, but 5 in particular are key for creating the climate necessary for a positive feeling of positive employee well-being. So the first one here is mental and emotional support. And this really relates to feelings and experiences that build and sustain positive mental energy. So when employees have good mental and emotional support, they're more likely to have what psychologists call positive attribution, or an optimistic attribution style. So this can build energy, hope, and confidence in people, which builds what we call psychological capital. Positive mental energy can greatly influence an individual's outlook and perceptions of their surroundings and their workplace. So a person who experiences strong mental and emotional support can better manage the stress and anxiety that comes with everyday life and work in particular. So the second key dimension that we looked at was having a sense of purpose. And this could come from feeling your work is fulfilling, your work has meaning, or you're making good progress at work. Having a strong sense of purpose has been linked to higher levels of resilience and more favorable views of your employers. So aligning a person's role with the organization's mission or identifying tasks as critical can foster a high sense of purpose or fulfillment. The next one we looked at or identified was personal support. So we know that working with others, especially your managers, who create a safe, trusting, and respectful atmosphere, can be an important predictor of employee well-being. Employees with the high levels of workplace flexibility and job control, so as seen through emerging hybrid work arrangements, which we're talking about today, as well as having the resources to accomplish their goals, they have evidence of personal support. Managers can also demonstrate support through supporting their employees to grow personally and professionally. So career growth, career development, things like that. The fourth really important one here is financial health. So we know that when employees lack adequate financial resources, anxiety and fear can affect their outlook. So some people might argue that people are never satisfied with their compensation, but it's important that employees feel they're earning enough to feel financially stable and capable of living freely. We also know that financial dissatisfaction can also arise when there is inequity in a workplace's compensation practices. And so this really highlights the importance of equal pay for equal work, fair promotion practices, and so on. And then the last dimension we identified was around meaningful connections. So supportive social relationships can be associated with lower stress levels. And having meaningful and caring relationships with coworkers and leaders is an integral part of the work experience, which many are finding more difficult in a hybrid relationship or a fully remote relationship. An environment of equity and inclusion is also necessary to create psychological safety and teamwork, which can foster a sense of belonging. So by creating a climate of mental support, purpose, financial health, and meaningful connections, business leaders can provide a foundation for positive well-being that allows employees to flourish. But how do you do all this? So we talk a little bit, sometimes we try and focus on what are the programs, practices, benefits we can introduce. So we know that office gyms and meditation breaks are nice, but as we have seen, employee well-being is much more complex than your physical fitness and mindfulness. So let's look at what we would say are 6 tips for supporting positive employee well-being. And so that's the next slide here. So the first most important, and I'll reiterate Dr. Amel's comments, is you need to stay close to your employees. You need to talk to them. You need to listen to them. So in one way, shape, or form, you need to measure employee well-being regularly. So we know that employees' needs are individualized and they're always evolving. What employees are asking for today is completely different than what they might have been asking for 2 or 3 years ago. So this underscores the importance of running a survey, listening, having focus groups, listening groups, and measuring essential tools for understanding employees' current experiences and tailoring strategies to support them. And I would also add to this, the integrated data sets that Dr. Amel was alluding to would be really valuable here. So not just evaluating what your employees are thinking, feeling, asking for, but also how this overlays with their health data that you see in the organization. So as I mentioned, Great Place to Work, we are workplace assessment experts. We have a tried and true method for gathering employee data on well-being. So I'm not going to get into that here, but we do have a virtual booth. We would love to see you there to learn more about how we survey employees and hone in on employee wellness data. So the second tip is sending powerful yet simple signals that well-being matters. So this could be simply acknowledging the emotional burdens employees are facing and letting them know their company and their leaders care for them and their organization is there to support them. So this could be simple as a leader modeling that behavior themselves. And so this is where those individual connections really matter. So it doesn't matter how great the blanket of programs are if we're not making those simple personal connections and sending those signals that their well-being matters, that they're cared for. The third piece is around connecting employees with experts that they need. So we know well-being needs personalization. So people like coaches, counselors, these are all critical resources that can help guide employees in developing strategies and skills to deal with their own unique situation. This is particularly true for mental health. This is an area where we see all of our best workplaces rapidly expanding their support, but also true for other types of support. The fourth one here, activate local champions. So we know well-being is an experience that's really shaped by personal interactions and group dynamics. And this is what employees experience in their day-to-day at work, whether they're in office or working remote. So when we enable employees at the team level to serve as role models and advocates, this can really inspire people and also advocate for a climate of well-being within the organization. And so we call these sort of workplace well-being champions or advocates that can really help you with your moving things along. And that's how you get to the culture piece when it becomes embedded, when we have many, many people living this on a day-to-day basis. The fourth one, fostering an environment of ongoing development and learning. This is not something you often hear associated with workplace well-being, but it's actually a key element, improving employees' capacity to achieve better well-being. This could be through self-development courses, mentorship, open communication about their professional goals, their work-life harmony. So this ongoing development, learning and learning support is a key element in employees' feelings of well-being. It helps foster their purpose, their connection, and also see a future for themselves at the workplace. And then the very last but not least is empowering people to really shape their own contribution. And this here we see again in the hybrid environment, allowing employees some level of autonomy in their work while linking the role to the outcomes of the organization. This provides employees with a greater sense of control and purpose, which we know are key elements in fostering well-being. Sometimes what we see is organizations attempting to repair poor employee well-being with band-aid fixes, like, oh, we have this new meditation app, or we're giving everyone a smartwatch. But like any problem in life, we have to uncover and get to the root causes and fix it at that level if you want a lasting solution. And so this circles back to the point number one, regularly measure and monitor employee well-being. If you're monitoring employee well-being and gathering their input, your data will really tell you where to focus. And so with that, I will turn it back over to you, Melissa. I hope you found these tips and this framework helpful for thinking about workplace well-being in a broader sense.
Thank you very much, Allison. That was fast and furious for sure. I've been taking notes really, really quickly. So that was really amazing. Just the kind of data that you're finding from all over the world and the way that we are able to capture some of the experiences and that shift and change in the way that employees are relating to work and their expectations of their employers, and how that really is beginning to reflect culture and embodying what Dr. Amel brought up around the blending of work and life, right? So I think that both of your presentations have been incredibly complimentary. So thank you both very, very much. I have a couple of questions just to kind of start off the conversation. I'm wondering about employers and employees who work in places where that hybrid option that is kind of the most popular option at the moment, where that's not possible, right? So Dr. Amel, you brought up a couple of these. So kind of healthcare providers and teachers I'm thinking about, and other folks who work in construction perhaps, or in food service. These are environments where employees kind of have to be on site. How can we manage a workplace that is perhaps entirely in person, and kind of thinking about hybrid work from that perspective, but also thinking about it in terms of a place of work that has both, right? That has some employees that need to be at work all the time and some employees that can do their work from a home environment.
I can take a stab at this one. So I think one of the pieces that we identified early on, even before people began returning to the workplace en masse, was this whole connection between the new world of work or new hybrid arrangements and the inclusion piece that many of us have been working so hard on for these past few years. And so one of the things I think is that hybrid work actually has the potential to really advance the inclusion movement. So if you think about people with physical barriers to getting to the office, physical barriers to getting transportation to the office, people whose personal work style, they might have challenges in social settings, but better on their own. So I think hybrid really affords us the ability to really advance the inclusion movement. However, we need to make sure that hybrid versus working in office doesn't become a new divisive category. So we're hearing, you're essential workers, you must come to the office because you're essential workers. And so we need to remember to treat our essential workers like the essential workers that they are. So it might not mean they can work from home, but how else can we support flexibility, work-life balance for the people? Because we know that this whole hybrid thing really only impacts around 40, I don't know, Tyler, if you have stats on this, but it's maybe around 40% of jobs that are even have the potential for hybrid. So we're not talking about everybody. So I think we need to be careful there.
Yeah, I would agree with everything Allison just said. It's very interesting because prior to this morning's conference, I gave another webinar, and it wasn't necessarily on the future of work or anything, but this one was about a digital platform for engaging users. It's a platform called Burnalong. So some of you may be familiar with it, and it's quite interesting because they're part of the MetaKeeper solution. That's part of a different conversation entirely. But the CEO of Burnalong talked about the inclusive nature of their platform, and he said that in a recent launch with the HR department rolling out Burnalong to this group, a person in a wheelchair, a person who uses a wheelchair, came up and said, "Thank you. This is the first time I've actually ever felt like I'm part of this organization, because there's ever been anything to do with health and productivity, health and wellness, occupational health and safety that actually spoke to her as an individual." And I was floored by that comment. But what it does, it's reflective of the fact that historically we haven't had a good track record when it comes to driving these sorts of elements and making sure that everybody is included in our overarching strategies in this sense. And something I've been saying to many employers over the past couple of years is that, occupational health and workplace health and productivity, they've never been at the top of HR's list of issues, right? Compensation, payroll, you name it, everything is always higher on the list of priorities than workplace health. And that's part of our challenge and our raison d'etre over the past while is to really elevate the occupational health and the workplace health discussion to a higher degree. Now, because of the COVID-19 disease and SARS-CoV-2 virus, we have this perfect platform, as sad as it is that we had to go through a global pandemic to get to it. But now workplace health is on the top of everybody's mind. CEOs, CFOs, HR leadership, they're now having to look at workplace health through a much different lens. And it's accelerated the adoption of lots of different practices and lots of different approaches that are quite accretive to positive cultures and better business outcomes. Good health is good business. All the things that we've been saying for years, but largely focused and fallen on deaf ears to a certain degree. Not for all employers. There are some that certainly get it, buy into it, and truly want to help support the health of their people, but that's not the rule, and that's not across North America. That's not the number one area. So I think, whenever you layer on all these disparate aspects, you do see that, yes, the conversation has changed. We're at a better position now. We're at a crossroads. We have to capitalize on that movement and translate it into good, solid support for people on their health improvement journeys and get better organizational health as a solid byproduct of that, which I think is a win-win for everybody.
Yeah. Thank you very much to both of you. I think that mention of considering the intersectionality of how we're approaching things and that broader inclusion. And when we talk about DEI work, it's often just those three letters. And as an organization, Realize is really trying to get folks to include the A. Right? We're really trying to get accessibility into that acronym, but it's a bit of a challenge because it, is disability captured in inclusion? Yes, but maybe we need to be more explicit about it. Thinking about that experience that you just mentioned of the person who is using a wheelchair not feeling part of an organization. And I think that some of the pieces that Allison, you mentioned in earlier, as we talk about kind of that big employee well-being and how we get there, is also, it can be talked about as belonging. right? And that's something that people are really seeking, and it is becoming part of that conversation. How do we connect people and really engage belonging as part of that workplace culture, part of the water we're all swimming in? So both of you really centered data collection in what you talked about today. And I want to try and connect these two ideas. So how do we ensure that intersectional data collection? It's challenging, I know. I've spent a little bit of time researching artificial intelligence and job applications, and it makes it very challenging to have a broadly inclusive data set because we don't often collect data on people with disabilities, right? So how do you get that AI to be inclusive? So intersectional data collection, how are we doing that? How is it even possible?
Yeah, I'll tackle this one, Allison, if you don't mind to start, and then I'd love to hear your thoughts on it afterwards. Integrated data sets, data lakes, what people are talking about these days, and how do we bring disparate data sources together to form, I once made a comment off the cuff with an employer saying, well, workplace health is just a rich tapestry, which is very true in the sense that there's an awful lot of moving parts to it. It tends to be traditionally siloed. You've got data sets relating to health experience or perhaps work disability or absence leave and disability experience in one set that other people don't get access to. Pretty hard to control and prevent whenever you don't know what the cause of and durations of illness and injury are. So there's a whole host of issues associated with that. It is quite difficult to do for most organizations to really layer on the disparate aspects of things that are actually meaningful and make sense. From a health perspective, which is the area that I tend to play in and don't really get too far beyond that, whenever I'm brought into an organization, I equate health and health injury outcome and illness outcome and health status to productivity. So, for an example, I was working with an employer years ago, and we were doing a deep dive on injuries and illnesses in ambulance workers. So I wanted to know what type of calls they were responding to, what the volume was, because we wanted to gain insight into psychological risk, the health profile, the actual disease risk. And the employer at the time was like, well, what difference does that make? And I'm like, well, we're operating under the presupposition that from a workers' compensation perspective, there's a work-related nature to these injuries and illnesses. We need to know everything we can about the nature of the work and combine that with what we know about the health outcomes, and then maybe help design and improve that risk profile. So, I think we've come a long way since then. People are really understanding the relationship, particularly between psychological stress and psychological state and what's happening on the work side, the supervisor relationships, the policies. In many places, our approaches to work disability are iatrogenic in nature. We cause disability to a certain degree. We cause prolonged experience. We cause higher costs because of the policies and practices that are in place for a variety of reasons. So we have all these things that have tremendous amount of data tied to them. It is quite difficult to thread them all together into one meaningful data set to connect all the dots, if you will. And I'm giving a talk next week in the southern US, and it's all about connecting these dots between the disparate aspects. But this does open the door because people have a difficult time making sense of huge volumes of data, which is where artificial intelligence and machine learning come into play, is because they can make sense to a certain degree of these data elements and try and thread together that narrative and that story and look for those commonalities, look for those relationships that I think are quite crucial. Now, not everybody needs that. If you look at most organizations out there, they're all small employers, small numbers, less than 50, less than 100, but they make up the lion's share. So you don't actually need to deploy those types of solutions unless you're looking at broad population health measures from a workplace health perspective. But there's some really interesting things that can be done whenever you start threading them together. But it's, to answer your question directly, Melissa, it's not easy to do. The tools are there. They're getting better as it is right now. And there are some good quality, there's even some good quality Canadian companies out there providing AI solutions that organizations can employ, particularly from a health perspective, and look at benefit optimization, look at outcomes, look at risk control, and those sort of things. But there's no easy way to do it.
And I would agree with you. Like, we're often asked by employers when we're sharing our data, how can we overlay now our health data with this data we have on culture? And so when we collect data, we do have, about 13, 14 standard demographics that we segment by, but none of what we collect, other than the question, are you experiencing mental, physical, psychological health condition that's, I can't remember the wording, but we have that identifier. But the problem becomes, if you're dealing with two sets of aggregate data, aggregate culture data and aggregate health data, how do you know where those connections truly are? And so one of the things we're doing in Canada here is we're just introducing a healthy place to work model and methodology, which is an offshoot of Great Place to Work, but slightly different. And this survey is really unique because it puts together personal health data along with the culture data. So then we're able to make those connections more clearly and give better advice to organizations. For instance, when people are reporting low levels of financial security, they're 10 times more likely to experience this, and this element of the culture. And so I really love this data. I think it has a lot of potential because while still guaranteeing anonymity for the respondent, we're able to make those connections. Now, aggregate to aggregate is good, but it's not as good as being able to follow the data with a particular person.
Yeah, and if there's one thing I could add in here, just hearing you speak remind me of this, Allison. Remember I mentioned that article from American Journal of Health Promotion where I looked at the health risk behaviors during the pandemic and how the current state of workforce health is taking a significant step back. For an event a couple of weeks ago, I went back to that data set and I added in race and gender identity data. And it totally changed the outcome. So to your point, Melissa, if we're not collecting those data elements, and fortunately I used a huge health risk assessment, the data set. And so I have access to those data elements. And, we broke it down by African-American males and females, Hispanics, white individuals, and then reanalyze the data. And if you're not actually looking at the data through that lens, you could be programming from a workplace health perspective completely something that's not going to resonate with the people whom that you're trying to support. And I was kind of shocked at the degree of differences, even in terms of people who are raising their hand and asking for access and support for mental health initiatives or stress, depression, anxiety risk, these sort of things. It varied by race significantly. Now, there wasn't enough gender identity data to really draw any meaningful conclusions, but the race data alone were something that, and whenever I do this again in the future, I'm absolutely going to have to incorporate those sort of data elements in, because the story changes whenever you factor in these types of elements. So to historically marginalized populations, to your point, Melissa, how do we get to those data elements? Well, it's easy when we're using a standardized and NCQA certified HRA, but to Allison's point, whenever we start threading in the rest of the story, we may not necessarily have that because there's no bona fide reason to ask it other than beyond health risk.
And our data echoes that exactly. So even with this most recent study with Johns Hopkins, so we talk about purpose and belonging. And so you get your stats. But then when you look at the purpose and belonging amongst people who belong to traditional minority groups, the gap just widens so much. And so that's why a lot of the work we do is not just saying, let's look at your results on average, but let's actively seek out these gaps in workplace experience that are really going to help you hone in on where you need to focus.
Thank you both. I'm so glad to hear that this kind of data analysis is beginning to include some of this other information so that we have that academic and rigorous kind of research reflecting the real stories of what's going on rather than kind of the, this is the average story. And that's not always indicative of what people are experiencing. I do have to get us to a couple of questions from participants here. I've got one specifically for Dr. Amel, which is, do you distinguish between working from home and working remotely? So in, I think, some of that research and data that you've presented.
Yeah, it's a good question. I've asked myself that exact same question numerous times. We do see, and we did see a trend prior to the pandemic, where folks would work remotely, either from a working vacation sort of thing, or you heard all the anecdotes about people working from Starbucks and coffee shops and those sort of things, not necessarily working from that traditional home environment, but for one reason or another using that sort of thing. Now, you bring up a very good point, because some of the research, especially the stuff that's in the popular literature, doesn't necessarily differentiate between working remotely and truly working from home. In the working from home data sets that we have access to, particularly those during the shelter in place orders at the start of the pandemic and then moving towards other ones like that, we tend to have some pretty good data. Plus, in the ones that I mentioned around the study of the pre and post hurricane situation in the US, where they looked at productivity in relation to purely working from home. But in this sense, home was a highly variable term, because it was most likely from a relative's place or from a vacation property or something like that, because their homes were actually, when the hurricane hit, obviously the workplace was wiped out, and rendered inactive for a certain period of time. But a lot of people lived nearby, so they had to find alternative residences and those sort of stuff. So, it's kind of all over the map with regards to it. I think for our purposes here today, working remotely, I think can be used as a correlate for the most part, but there are some subtle differences, I think, which do come up from time to time.
Okay. Thank you very much for just giving us a little sense of that distinction, because I even noticed it in my language. I suddenly realized, oh, do I mean home or do I mean remotely? What am I talking about? I do have another question that's very interesting and about privacy. So how do we assess and help to improve employee wellness while also considering privacy issues? A lot of this is about health information and that willingness of employees to share those pieces of their lives and experience. How about we go over to Allison first and see if you can.
Yeah, and this is one of the most common questions that we get is, if I fill out this survey, whether I'm divulging health information or not, is it truly anonymous, or will my employer know what I said? And we also ask for writing comments. So people obviously have a concern about being identified. And so our whole business and business model hinges on anonymity of employee data. And so the guarantee that we give to people who are completing a survey is nobody will ever know what you said. Nobody will even know if you completed the survey or not. And with regards to the demographic categories, so gender, LGBTQ, et cetera, those identifiers that we collect, we often have people who don't want to respond to those, and that's perfectly okay. I think a lot of times they don't understand why we need that data. And so there's a real opportunity to message, because our whole model is hinging on not creating great places to work for some, but for all. And that requires that we go after the gaps in workplace experience, which we can only do if employees are willing to share that data. When you're asking for, gender, people are often okay, years of service, age, but some of the more personal questions, people are more reluctant to share.
Yeah, absolutely. I am thinking about disability in that context.
Yeah,
right?
So we get, just to put it in perspective, when I look at sort of our data on a macro level, it's only around 10%, 5 to 8% that prefer not to answer on those demographics. Once it exceeds 10%, then we begin to wonder if there's something around communication or some issues with trust in the organization, which is why people prefer not to answer. But anything around sort of the 5 to 8% is fairly standard.
Okay, thanks. Okay, a couple more questions coming in from folks here. How do you ensure that accommodation needs continue to be met in a hybrid work environment? How does that unfold for employers and employees?
Yeah, that's a really interesting one. You know, it was primarily from a safety perspective earlier on in the pandemic, as organizations struggled to even find computers. You know, Dell, IBM, all those folks, they were sold out. You couldn't actually get notebooks unless you actually had a good stash in place. Now, when people pivoted and were working from home or working remotely, their setups weren't necessarily as safe or as supportive as the ones that they had in the workplace. You know, with usually good quality chairs, sit to stand workstations, all the traditional ergonomic type stuff. So organizations had to figure out how to you know, get people into a position whereby they could set up a home work environment and not miss too many steps while they're doing so, but also by extension continue to protect their health in that respect. And then that brings up the notion of accommodations. Now, if you do have a workplace that is 100% supported by the organization and is fully remote, well, your workplace now become, even if it is in your home, now becomes that protected entity covered under workers' compensation, covered under disparate things. So, you know, there's lots of different ways that organizations do have a little bit of liability in place when it comes time to measure and support the health of their individuals from that way, particularly from that accommodation perspective as to how you actually go about doing that. And then of course there is other layers of accommodation beyond the physical workspace that I just mentioned. There's lots of other things that come into place with regards to, you know, how do you support, you know, flexible working arrangements, these sort of things. In fact, it's a lot easier working remotely or working from home to accommodate some folks who may present with a desire to be accommodated for a disability or another aspect. So there's a few different lenses that you can apply that, and sometimes it actually works in your favor to have a distributed workforce like that than it does in a traditional work environment where you don't necessarily have that flexibility.
Okay, thank you very much. We do have to wrap up at this point. We are about 3 minutes away from 1:30. I just want to say thank you. This has been such an incredibly rich conversation, and I hope that folks are kind of wrapping up this experience with as much knowledge and perhaps as many notes as I've got. So thank you very, very much to both of you. I'm going to hand it back over to Emma.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Melissa, Dr. Amel, and Allison, for that really engaging, very interesting discussion. As we've reached our time, I'll leave everyone with just a few notes of rest of the day and where to go from here. So first off, the presentation was recorded and it will be posted for free on our website along with the slides. And again, you can find those under Files on your FeedLoop page. If you're interested in receiving a certificate of attendance, please navigate to our Accreditation Opportunities page in the menu on the left-hand side of your screen. By purchasing all 3 panel certificates today, you can receive an annual WWI membership, guaranteeing unlimited certificates for e-courses, webinars, and more. Organizational and individual WWI members, you will be receiving a free certificate. Our next session, Worker Wellbeing and the Gig Economy, begins at 10:50 Pacific Standard Time. In the meantime, we've created an active break for you and encourage you to explore the exhibitor hall, have a conversation with a fellow attendee in networking, and make sure you keep an eye out for our live graphic recording coming soon in the Showcase Gallery, where you'll also find current research projects and posters. But before you leave this page, please remember to fill out the session survey, which you'll find linked in the description on your FeedLoop page. Thank you again, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you soon.